honorable educators, distinguished members, and fellow debaters. Today, we confront a structural failure of Indonesian democracy, which is the persistent underrepresentation of women in political office. Despite comprising of half of the population, women continue to be sidelined in legislative institutions. Due to systemic discrimination, this is not just unfair, it is undemocratic. As the opening government, our team, believe that it is time to legally require political parties in Indonesia to nominate a minimum of quota of women candidates at both national and local level. Our timeline is simple. To achieve meaningful gender equality, we must ensure equal access to power. Quotas create that access, which will dismantle the barrier between them. I would like to define the motion. By quota, we mean a minimum percentage of 30% of party-nominated candidate must be women, according to UU number 2, 2008, and KPU Regulation number 10 on 2023. In Indonesia legislature, women remain vastly underrepresented. Based on KPU data and Kompas, they confirm that women representation as of late 2024, women occupy only 21.8% of DPR seats, which is 127 out of 580. Despite the 30% quota law, this persistent underrepresentation exposed the failure of voluntary or enforced quotas for women. The underrepresentation is due to structural barriers, not lack of merit or ambition. Women face three things that bind them. First one is patriarchal norms that discourage leadership roles. The second one is funding gaps, where women lack access to campaign capital. Third one is party gatekeeping, where elite male networks dominate nomination. Based on 2023 LIPI study, found that parties often treat quotas as symbolic, nominating women only in unelectable positions. Others, such as UNDP Indonesia, shows that Indonesia elections are extremely costly, and women lack access to political finances. This means the playing field is not on the same level. Quotas are essential to remove these systemic filters and create real access. Quotas accelerate gender equality in institutions. Institutions evolve when diversity becomes the norm. Quotas allow a chance for new female political figures to emerge, gain experience, and serve as role models. According to UN Women, quotas increase the number of first-time women MPs and ministers, which encourage broader shifts in voters' attitudes and party culture. So that is why quotas don't just add women in politics, but they build a future leadership based for women leadership. Gender diverse legislators strengthen democracy. When government reflects the people they serve, citizens feel more included and represented. This increases trust in democratic institutions. A few research studies in 2024 reports that across 17 countries, voters perceive gender-balanced parliament as more legitimate, and responsive. In contrast, exclusion erodes confidence in the system. That is why quotas is not just a feminist issue, they are also democratic necessity. They will make Indonesia political system more representative, more inclusive, and more accountable. The time for symbolic gesture is over. We have shown you that women's underrepresentation is not accidental. It is the product of structural barriers that demand structural solution. Quotas are not about special treatments. They are about restoring balance and fairness in a system that has included women for too long. By mandating a minimum quota of women candidates, We correct injustice, improve policy outcomes, accelerate gender equality, and strengthen the foundation of our democracy. For this reason, we are proud to propose this. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, honorable educators and fellow debaters, as the leader of opposition, my role today is very clear. First, I will directly refer to Prime Minister's case. And second, I will explain why the government misunderstands what empowerment and democracy truly mean. Let me begin by making one thing absolutely clear. The opposition does not deny that women are underrepresented in Indonesian politics. That problem is real. However, what separates this House is not a diagnosis, but the cure. Recognizing injustice does not mean we should accept every policy that claims to fix it. The Prime Minister agrees that women hold only around 21 to 22% of seats in the DPR, and therefore quotas are necessary. We agree with the numbers, but we reject the conclusion. Indonesia has already had a 30% candidate quota for years, yet women's representations remain far below the target, and in many electoral districts, no women are elected at all. This shows us something crucial. Quotas increase nominations, but they do not guarantee power. If a policy has existed for more than 2 decades and still fails to deliver its promised outcome, the rational response is not to strengthen it, but to question whether the policy itself is flawed. Next, the Prime Minister correctly identifies real structural barriers, such as patriarchy, funding gaps, and gatekeeping. This is exactly where their arguments collapses. Quotas do not protect women from being sidelined by party leaders. In practice, parties comply strategically. Women are placed in weak districts, low-risk positions, or nominated without meaningful support. As a result, women became names on paper rather than contenders for power. This turns quotas into a symbolic illusion rather than empowerment. Before we talk about increasing numbers, we must talk about readiness. Real gender equality is not created by placing women on ballots and hoping for the best. It is created by equipping women with the skills, resources, and visibility and hope that needed to win and govern effectively. Quotas focus on outcomes, not preparation. They can place candidates into hostile political arenas without giving them the tools to survive or succeed. In contrast, capacity building addresses the root problem by strengthening competence, confidence, and credibility. A clear example comes from Australia. Since 1996, Emily's List Australia has provided mentoring, campaign training, and over $5 million in targeted funding for women candidates. The result was not symbolic representation, but real electoral success. Women in Australia's Labour Party increased from just 14% to 48% of MPs, all achieved without gender quotas, according to a Ministry report in 2023. This proves that when women are supported with skills and resources, they win on merit. However, even the strongest candidates cannot succeed if they are not safe. This leads directly to my second argument. Building on that vulnerability gap, quotas may increase exposure without increasing protections. Mandates can force numbers onto ballots, but they do not mandate safety. When quotas are implemented without safeguards, they often push women into political spaces that are deeply violent and hostile. Instead of empowerment, this creates risks. Women are expected to compete, campaign, and govern while facing threats that their male counterparts already encounter. Mexico provides a stark warning. Despite adopting a 50% gender quota, violence against women in politics intensified. According to INEGI data, femicide against women politicians increased by 300% between 2018 and 2022. This shows that numerical equality did not translate into real protection. This violence does not only endanger individual candidates, it sends a message to voters that female leadership is unsafe, unstable, contested. As a result, public trust declines, and women's political participation becomes associated with crisis rather than progress. Madam Speaker, the government confused urgency with effectiveness and numbers with empowerment. Quotas may look progressive on paper, but in practice they risk being symbolic, stigmatizing, and democratically harmful. True empowerment must be earned, legitimate, and sustainable. For this reason, as the leader of opposition, I firmly urge this House to reject the motion. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, honorable adjudicators, and fellow executors. As the Deputy Prime Minister, my role today is to first directly respond to the rebuttals raised by the opposition. Second, I will reinforce why mandatory quotas remain necessary in Indonesian political context. The opposition argues that because Indonesia already has a 30% quota, yet women only hold 21.8% of DPR seats for KPU 2024, quotas must be ineffective. This conclusion is flawed. What this actually shows is weak enforcement, not policy failure. According to UN Women 2022 and the Interparliamentary Union in 2023, quotas only work when they are strictly enforced and accompanied by placement rules. In Indonesia, parties often comply formally while placing women in unwinnable districts and facing little to no sanctions, a problem also identified by LIPI in 2023. Countries that strengthened enforcement saw real progress. Mexico increased women's representation from 22% to nearly 50% after introducing strict placement rules and penalties, while France doubled the number of women MPs after imposing financial sanctions on non-compliant parties. This proves the issue is implementation, not the quota itself. For my second rebuttal, the leader of opposition claims quotas do nothing to address funding gaps and party gatekeeping. However, evidence shows quotas are a necessary entry point. According to UNDP Indonesia 2021, access to campaign funding, donor networks, and media exposure depends heavily on party nomination. Without quotas, women are filtered out before they can access these resources. Quotas force parties to invest in women candidates and integrate them into political networks. Research by Norris in 2014 confirms that quotas function as institutional door openers. They do not solve every problem, but they make meaningful participation possible. For our third rebuttal is that the deputy leader of opposition argues that quotas create weak or proxy women leaders, citing India. However, even the World Bank in 2018 studies shows that proxy behavior declined significantly after 2 election cycles, as women gain political experience and confidence. Furthermore, political inexperience is not unique to women. Many male politicians enter parliament without prior experience, yet their legitimacy is rarely questioned. This reflects a double standard. According to IPU in 2022, women elected to quotas perform equally well in legislative activities once institutional barriers are reduced. For our fourth and final rebuttal is that the opposition claims quotas reduce voter trust. However, broader evidence contradicts this. The Pew Research Center in 2024 found that across 17 countries, gender-balanced parliaments are perceived as more legitimate and responsive, particularly among women and younger voters. Additionally, voters already accept non-merit-based advantages such as political dynasties and party elites. Targeting quotas alone as undemocratic is inconsistent. Democracy is weakened by not by inclusion, but by systematic exclusion. For our defense, on why quotas remain necessary is that while capacity building programs are important, they are insufficient on their own. Programs like Emily's List in Australia succeed due to low campaign costs and strong institutions. Indonesia, according to UNDP in 2022, has one of the most expensive electoral systems in Southeast Asia. Without quotas, trained and capable women are often denied sometimes. Quotas ensure that political talent is given real access to power. Madam Speaker, the opposition asks us to rely on voluntary change in a system that has excluded women for decades. Evidence shows us that such change does not happen on its own. Mandatory quotas, when properly enforced, dismantle gatekeeping, normalize women's leadership, and strengthen democracy. For these reasons, we proudly support this motion. Thank you.
Honorable adjudicators, distinguished members, and fellow citizens. Today, the government clings to quotas as a lazy shortcut to equality, but I stand firmly against them. Quotas don't build women leaders, they undermine them, building resentment and fragility in our democracy. As a deputy leader of opposition, I'll first dismantle the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister case with targeted abuse and this starts with exposing how quotas fail structural barriers entirely. First, quota don't accelerate equality, they create total leaders without real power. Turning now to their myth of accelerated equality, the government asserts quotas spawn new female figures without who gain experience, serve as a role model and shape attitudes per UN data. But reasoning exposes the devastating flaw. Quotas produced unskilled first-time member of parliament who became proxies failed spectacularly and reinforced stereotypes rather than dismantle them. India's 33% of panchayat quotas included local councils with inexperienced women. Yet, the World Bank 2018 found 40% acted as proxies for male relatives. Policy priorities remain unchanged. And voter attitudes towards women leaders showed zero improvement after a decade. These women gained no real experience, just ridiculous. Rwanda achieved 61% female member of parliament through voluntary training, not mandates, according to IPU in 2022. This fake acceleration doesn't build leadership pipelines. It erodes them, flowing directly into why their diverse democracy claims collapses. And the second is, gender diverse quota weaken democracy by destroying voters' trust. Building that eroded legitimacy, they claim there's balanced parliaments across 17 countries. Wrong. It reveals quotas create perceived diversity that voters instinctively reject as artificial, tanking institutional trust far more than male dominance ever did. Britain's all-women shortlist quota equivalent saw voters' approval plummet 35% in targeted seats as communities cried unfair, according to YouGov in 2021. Legitimacy gains occur only with merit-based diversity. Quota in Argentina registered 28% lower institutional trust than organic Nordic models where women earn seats through talent, according to Latino Barometro in 2023. Voters don't want imposed balance, they demand earned representation. With their entire case now in ruins, let's turn these failures into our winning alternative through capacity. I will now present our arguments. The first one is, what is the legitimacy crisis for imposed candidates? Compounding the trust erosion from violence and vulnerability, voters instinctively reject quota queens as unearned impositions that mock meritocracy itself. This isn't temporary backlash, it is a permanent legitimacy wound. The reasoning cuts deep. When the citizens perceive candidates work through government mandate rather than talent and hustle, they question every decision, policy, and vote cast by those representatives. Britain's voluntarily all-women shortlist faced 40% backlash, with communities chanting undemocratic and outdropping 12% of targeted seats, according to YouGov in 2021. Contrast merit-based New Zealand, where women Prime Minister like Jacinda Ardern rose through respected talent pipelines and commanded 68% approval ratings without a whiff of voters' controversy, according to IPU in 2024. Voters don't just tolerate excellence, they celebrate it while punishing artifice. Quotas candidates spend their careers proving their legitimacy rather than governing. And the second is, true improvement is bottom-up, not top-down. Culminating all these quotas induce flaws. Government mandates don't just fail, they actively stifle the organic growth that voters craft and communities sustain long-term. Bottom-up empowerments create victories that multiply naturally. The reasons prove itself through real-world cycles. When women rise through civil society, training, mentorship networks, and community support system, their success inspires sisters, daughters, and neighbors to follow without resentment or government coercion. Tunisia's post-Arab Spring civil society networks trained 25% women voluntarily embraced female representation in local councils by 35%. This dwarfed quota-dependent neighbors like Egypt, who stagnate at artificial 28% parties despite mandates, according to UN Women 2023. These grassroots victors changed party selections rules from within, created mentorship chains, and built coalitions that endures election cycles. No proxies, no resentment, just multiplications. These connected truths form our unassailable case. Capacity beats quotas, safety beats exposure, legitimacy comes through merit, empowerment grows through communities. These forge unbreakable women leaders who don't just participate but dominate. Oppose quota, vote for reform that lasts. Thank you.
Honorable educators, fellow debaters, and ladies and gentlemen, I will begin by reinforcing the fundamental imbalance identified by the opening governments. According to Badan Pusat Statistik or BPS, women make up 49.42% of Indonesia population. Yet, this demographic reality is not reflected in political institutions. Nationally, women hold only around 1/5 of seats in DPR. And based on DPRD 2024 data, women representation in the local level is even lower, averaging around the mid-teens, with some regions occurring single-digit or zero female legislators. When nearly half of the population is consistently excluded from power across regions and electoral cycle, this cannot be explained by individual merit or voter choice. It is structural exclusion. The opponent opposition accept the problem of underrepresentation but reject quota as the solution, arguing that quota are inadequate, symbolic, and the beginning of legitimacy. However, the comparative study by Madman and Yao in 2025 directly contradicts this claim. The research showed that Indonesia has the largest gap between women's share of the population and women's share of parliamentary seats when compared to the Timor-Leste and Finland. This gap is not accidental. It is produced by weak enforcement of nomination rules and man-dominated party structure, especially at the local level. And the opposition also claims quota failed because Indonesia already has the 30% requirement. The market study clarified why this argument is flawed. In Indonesia, quota exists formally, but parties frequently comply strategically, placing women in non-competitive position or nominating them without meaningful support. This does not show quota are inherently flawed. It is so that non-mandatory or weekly enforced quota do not alter party behavior. By contrast, Timor-Leste apply clear nomination and placement rules, resulting in around 40% women in parliament despite facing similar culture and economic conflict. And the opposition has argued that quota do not address funding gaps, elite levels, or patriarchy. But Makmun's study explicitly identified party nomination patterns as the decisive gate-taking mechanism. At the local level in Indonesia, candidate selections is controlled by males, party elites, patronage network, and financial barriers. Women are filtered out before the elections even begins. Mandatory nomination quota intervenes at the precisely the states, forcing parties to include women not as symbols but as actual contenders. So and now I will bring my main argument. Local level exclusion is the root cause of the national underrepresentation, and without mandatory quota at the local level, Indonesia will never close the gender gap nationally. Makmun and Yani comparative analysis show that countries with the stronger women's representations do not rely on the national level alone. In both Timor-Leste and Finland, women gain political experience early through local council, party structure, and internal quota. Indonesia fails because women are excluded from the EPRD in the first place. Political careers in Indonesia are bottom up. When women are absent from the local legislators today, they are absent for the national leadership tomorrow. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of exclusion. And the study also further showed that stronger discrete representation leads to the stronger substantive representation. In Timor-Leste and Finland, women parliamentary actively coordinate through women's caucus and civil society networks to advance gender responsive policy. In Indonesia, the Women Parliamentary Caucus remains weak precisely because women enter parliament too late. In too few numbers and without institutional backing from their parties, number matter because they determine influence. So it is not about privilege, it is about proportionality and democratic corrections. When 49.42% of Indonesian population is considered excluded from political power, especially at the local level, the state has responsibility to intervene. The evidence from Indonesia on data and from comparative research is clear. Voluntary measure fails, weak quota fail, and party discretion fails women. So for the representation that reflects reality, for leadership pipelines that are sustainable, and for a democracy that is genuinely inclusive, this House must support the government. So thank you.
Madam Speaker, honorable adjudicators, and fellow debaters, as the member of the opposition, I will do two things in this speech. First, I will rebut the expansion and the border government, and second, I will present our expansion and public trust, legitimacy, and better alternative. First, the government claims that symbolic representation automatically leads to policy influence. We strongly disagree. Simply placing more women in candidate lists does not guarantee that women will have real power in policy making. In many cases, women are nominated only to fulfill administrative requirements, placed in unwanted district, or positioned at the bottom of the party list. This turns representation into a symbolic gesture, not meaningful political influence. Therefore, quotas solve the appearance of inclusion, not the substance of power. Second, the government argues that quotas empower women. However, quota can backfire. When women are elected under a mandatory quota system, they often face the assumption that they won because of gender, not competence. This creates what we call quota stigma, where female politicians are seen as less legitimate than their male counterparts. Instead of empowering women, quota can unintentionally undermine their credibility and authority. Third, forcing political parties to comply with strict quotas reduces organizational autonomy. Political parties are complex institutions with different ideology, recruitment systems, and local contexts. When the state forces all parties to nominate a fixed number of women, parties may respond by recruiting unprepared candidates simply to avoid sanctions. This weakness internal party development and turn gender equality into a checkbox exercise. Most importantly, Indonesia's past quota attempts already show these failures. Even when women are nominated, there is a low convention into actual elected seats. This proves that nomination quotas alone do not solve structural barriers like campaign fundings, political violence, and voter bias. Finally, the government focuses on numbers, but representation quality matters more than quantity. Having more women in parliamentary means very little if they lack resources, influence, or public trust. Mandatory quota risks weakening public trust in elected women. When voters believe that candidates are chosen because of gender requirements rather than merits, they begin to question the legitimacy of the entire political process. This damages not only female politicians but also democratic trust more broadly. In the long term, quotas create legitimacy problems in policy making. Policies proposed by women may be dismissed or challenged more harshly, not because the ideas are weak, but because their authority is constantly questioned. This places an unfair burden on women to prove themselves repeatedly, while male politicians are assumed to be competent by default. This situation harms truly capable women the most. Highly qualified women become trapped under the same stereotypes as token candidates, losing recognition for their actual skill, experience, and leadership. Moreover, public dissatisfaction can increase when voters feel that their choices are engineered by the states. Democracy relies on voters' trust and freedom of choice. When candidates' lists appear artificially designed, voters may disengage or vote strategically or reject female candidates altogether out of protest. Instead of mandatory quotas, we propose better and more sustainable solution. First, internal party reform that genuinely supports women leadership. Second, equal access to campaign resources and funding. Third, strong anti-violence and anti-harassment mechanism for women in politics, especially in local level. In conclusion, mandatory gender quotas may look progressive, but in practice they risk being symbolic, stigmatizing, and counterproductive. They weaken public trust, undermine legitimacy, and fail to address real structural barriers. For this reason, as a member of the opposition, I strongly urge this House to reject the motion. Thank you.
Honorable educators, ladies and gentlemen, as the government whip, my role is to close this debate by showing you why the government team clearly wins and why the opposition has failed to offer a realistic or effective alternative to the problem of women's unrepresentations in Indonesia politics. At the core of this debate, there is one fundamental question. Can a system that is structurally unequal ever produce fair outcomes without interventions? The government team's answer is no, and the opposition never successfully disproved this. First, on the issue of meritocracy. Opposition repeatedly claims that quotas undermine meritocracy, but this argument assumes that meritocracy currently exists, and that assumption is false. As established by the Prime Ministers, according to KPU data and Kompas in 2024, women currently occupy only 21.8% of DPR seats, or 127 out of 580 seats. Despite making up nearly half of the population and despite decades of nominal quotas regulations, these persistent gaps prove one thing. Equal rules do not produce equal outcomes in an unequal system. In Indonesia, women face systemic barriers long before elections even begins. They have less access to campaign funding, weaker political networks, internal party discriminations, and higher risk of political harassment and violence. A 2023 LIPI study confirms that political parties often treat quotas symbolically, nominating women only in unelectable positions. Meanwhile, UNDP Indonesia reports that elections in Indonesia are among the most expensive in the regions, a system that disproportionately disadvantages women due to limited access to political finance. In such a system, competition is not fair. Quotas do not remove merit, but they restore fairness at the entry point. Importantly, quotas do not guarantee elections outcomes. They only guarantee access to nominations, so voters still decide who wins. So, the opposition's meritocracy argument has collapsed because merit can exist without equal opportunity. Second, on chauvinism and legitimacy. Opposition argues that quotas create chauvinism and delegitimize women leaders. But chauvinism already exists without quotas. When women are excluded or treated as symbolic figures with no institutional support. What quotas do is normalize women's presence in politics. When representation becomes consistent and visible, stigma will fade. As highlighted by the government bench, UN Women finds that quota system significantly increased the number of first-time women MPs and ministers, which over time shift party cultures and voter attitudes. Feasibility leads to normalizations, not delegitimations. More importantly, the opposition never explains why women deserve to be trusted less than men once nominated. Voters still assess competence, track record, and also credibility. So, quotas do not delegitimize women, but systematic exclusions does. Third, on democracy and party autonomy. Opposition claims quotas are undemocratic and interfere with party freedom. But democracy has never meant the absence of rules, right? Indonesia already regulates elections through electoral thresholds, simple finance laws, and parties requirements under Undang-Undang Number 2 in 2008 and KPU Regulations Number 10 in 2023. Quotas will operate in the same way. They regulate opportunity, not the outcomes. Parties still choose their candidates, and voters still choose who gets elected. More importantly, a Pew Research Center study in 2024 across 17 countries shows that voters perceive gender-balanced parliaments as more legitimate and responsive. Preventing the systemic exclusions of half the population strengthens democracy. It does not weaken it. Fourth, on effectiveness and Indonesia's context. Opposition claims that quotas do not work in Indonesia because not all women candidates are elected. But this misunderstood the purpose of quotas. Quotas are not an instant fix, but they are structural corrections. They will create pipelines, force parties to invest in women's political development, and gradually shift political culture. The increasing proportions of women candidates over successive elections will show that quotas do change the party behavior, even if cultural transformation takes time. Opposition provides no evidence that doing nothing or relying on voluntary reform will work better. Now, we can compare two sides of this. The government team offers, first, guaranteed access to political competitions, second, structural corrections of systematic bias, third, real enforcements that force parties to change, and fourth, representations that reflects Indonesian party. While the other hand, opposition team offers voluntary reform, second, training programs without enforcement, and hope the parties will change on their own. But decades of voluntary reform have already failed. When the system is broken, inaction is choice, and the opposition is the wrong one. So we can conclude that on impact, government improves representations and democratic legitimacy. On probability, government offers enforced reform, while oppositions offer uncertainty. On principle, government defends equality of opportunity in a structural unequal system. This debate is not about whether quotas are perfect, but it is about whether they are necessary and better than the alternatives. And on the equations, the government clearly wins. Without quotas, exclusion continues. With quotas, opportunity will begin. For these reasons, this House must support the motions. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, honorable adjudicators and fellow debaters, as the opposition whip, my role is not to introduce new arguments, but to show this House why, after the full debate, the opposition clearly wins. I will do three things in this speech. First, I will crystallize the fundamental clash in this debate. Second, I will summarize the consistent opposition case against quota. Then third, I will explain why the second opposition's contribution decisively closes this debate on legitimacy, public trust, and democratic sustainability. At the core of this debate lies a simple but crucial question. Does increasing numbers through mandatory quotas create real empowerment and stronger democracy? Government says yes. The opposition across both teams has consistently proven that the answer is no. Yes, women are underrepresented in Indonesian politics, but recognizing injustice does not justify any policy that claims to fix it. What matters is whether the policy actually works. The opposition's first major response was clear. Underrepresentation alone does not justify quota. Indonesia has already implemented a 30% candidate quota for years, yet women's representation in parliament remains far below number. In many districts, no women are elected at all. This shows that quotas increase nomination, not power. If a policy has existed for decades and still fails to deliver meaningful outcomes, strengthening it blindly is irrational. This framing already weakens the government's core assumption that quotas are an effective tool. Second, the opposition showed that quotas do not remove structural barriers. Both opposition teams agree that the real obstacles facing women are patriarchy, funding gaps, party gatekeeping, political violence, and elite networks. Quotas do nothing to solve these problems. They do not give women campaign money, they do not grant access to party elites, they do not protect women from being sidelined once nominated. As highlighted repeatedly, parties calmly, strategically placing women in unwinnable districts or low position, turning quotas into symbolic compliance rather than empowerment. Third, opposition demonstrate that quota risks backlash and stigma instead of equality. Women elected under quota system are often labeled as quota candidates, facing harsher scrutiny and constant doubts about their competence. This does not normalize women's leadership. It reinforces the harmful idea that women need special rules to complete. Instead of breaking gender bias, quota can entrench it, forcing women to repeatedly prove their legitimacy in ways male politicians never have to. This directly leads to the most important contribution of the second opposition, the issue of legitimacy and public trust. The member of opposition made it clear that democracy is not about numbers. It is about belief. Voters must believe that candidates earn their position through fair competition. When candidate lists appear engineered by state mandates, public trust is weakened. This does not only harm female politicians, it harms democracy itself. The second opposition showed that symbolic representation does not equal policy influence. Women nominated only to fulfill administrative requirements often lack real power in policymaking. Their presence becomes cosmetic rather than substantive. As a result, representation looks inclusive on paper but remains hollow in practice. Most importantly, the second opposition explained how quota stigma creates long-term legitimacy problems. When voters believe candidates are chosen because of gender rather than merit, policy proposed by women are judged more harshly. Highly qualified women suffer the most because they are trapped under the same stereotypes as token candidates. This creates a vicious cycle. Women's authority is questioned, their effectiveness is undermined, and public trust erodes further. The member of opposition also emphasized that forced quota weaken party autonomy and internal development. When parties are compelled to meet rigid numerical requirements, they often require unprepared candidates to simply avoid sanctions. Gender equality becomes a checkbox exercise, not a genuine commitment. This explains why Indonesia's quota experience shows low conversation from nomination to election structural barriers remain untouched. Across both opposition benches, the comparison is consistent. The government focuses on urgency and numbers. The opposition focuses on effectiveness, legitimacy, and sustainability. While the government celebrates visibility, the opposition asks whether women actually get power, influence, and public trust. Crucially, opposition does not reject equality. We reject symbolic equality without substance. Both teams clearly stated that the real empowerment must come from internal party reform, equal access to funding and media, leadership training, and strong protections against political violence. This approach addresses root causes rather than masking them with statics. To close this debate is decided on outcomes, not intentions. The governments offer a policy that looks progressive but fails in practice. The opposition shows that quota risks being symbolic, stigmatizing, and democratically harmful. Through the leader of opposition, we established that quotas misunderstand our. To the member of opposition, we prove that quotas undermine legitimacy and public trust are the very foundation of democracy. Madam Speaker, when a policy weakens trust, erodes legitimacy, and fails to deliver real empowerment, it must be rejected. For these reasons, the opposition clearly wins the debate. Thank you.